So the end result of this convolution with a time course is a predicted time series. Okay, they're saying in an idealized perfect world, if there was a canonical just means kind of, off the shelf essentially. If there was a canonical HRF that was and if things added up together perfectly linearly, what would I predict? And then you could say, okay, now I have a bunch of predictors, and the kind of jargon term for them in statistics and fMRI is regressors. Okay, but they're really predictors. They're saying, if I think that something, if I think that my voxels respond to this stimulus, then I really ought to this degree, then I ought to expect this kind of MRI response to them. So then what you do is you say, okay, I'm going to make these predictors, regressors, for each of my different stimulus conditions. In this particular case, I just had one condition, a light. Okay. What if I have two conditions? I have a light and a sound or something like that. Okay. And we're going to look at that now. So if I've got these different predictors, can I use these predictors to figure out, say, for some particular part of the brain, well, does it seem to be responding more to this stimulus? Does it seem to be responding more to that stimulus? Does it seem to be responding kind of equally to both of them? And so that's really the essence of a kind of standard fMRI analysis. And so you put these, you literally just kind of join these predictors, these regressors together, and that's what's called the design matrix. And you'll see a lot about design matrices when you read fMRI papers. Now, it's worth pointing out that the end result of all this is just to give you, an estimate of how much a particular part of the brain lit up for some particular stimulus. How much did this voxel light up for the sound? How much did it light up for the light? And by light up, I mean, how much to what degree did it kick off an HRF? Did it kick off a big one or a little one? And I just spent the last couple of lectures, saying, we really don't care about this question so much of which bit of the brain lights up. But this is the first step, because, even if you don't care about that as an end in itself, which fewer and fewer people do care about these days, because they've realized, the real interesting questions kind of lie a couple of stages beyond that. But that's still, we want to estimate responses from different brain areas, and then we might do things like try and apply a classifier, for instance, to those brain responses. But first we've got to estimate them. So this is to estimate them. Okay, so all of these things that we just made are regressors. Okay, so there's lots of, you can read through this extremely verbose commentary, which I'm going to skip now. But this time, for this example, instead of using this kind of full-blown, nice, curvy HRF, which kind of goes up and down over 18 seconds, I'm going to make a kind of mini version of it, which it just kind of goes up, down a bit more, back to baseline, and which looks like this. Okay. So this is kind of like the discretized version of the previous one, and this actually, it turns out, is very much like what a scanner actually records, because in a scanner, generally, you remember how like an MRI scanner is kind of a cartoon strip, so you don't have generally, although you can, one image every single second. You might have, say, an image every 2 seconds. So you don't get this full smooth curve. You get just kind of like a lumpy chunked sample from that curve every now and again. So if you took that kind of smooth curve, and in this case you sampled from it, say, every 4 seconds, you'd get this kind of jaggedy thing that looks like this. But you can kind of mentally visualize maybe that it's really the same curve, except we're just kind of sampling from it less often. Okay, so suppose the jargon term for how often do we sample, how often do we get an image, is called TR, which stands for repetition time. I don't know why they swapped the order of the time of repetition. Okay, but that's what a TR is. You'll see this in papers. TR. It means how many seconds does it take to get each full brain volume picture. These days, a typical TR is about 2 seconds. For illustration here, I got a 4-second one, which is kind of how it used to be like a while ago. Okay, so suppose I've got two stimuli, a word and an object. Okay, and my job is to figure out for a particular voxel, well, to what degree is it responding to the word? To what degree is it responding to the object? So what we're going to do is we're going to make a predicted time series for what it would look like if it responded purely to the word, we're going to make a predicted time series for what it would respond, what this voxel would look like if it responded purely to the object, and then we're going to see to what degree does the actual signal that we actually measure from this voxel match with those kind of pure predictions. Okay, so and this is, as well as doing this, and because this is actually implemented in the Matlab, as well as this kind of being just a kind of cartoon explanation, this is actually literally doing the convolution and making the predicted signal. So I'm not going to go through all the copying and pasting here because I just ran the whole thing just by typing in the name of the script without the .m at the end. You can't see that actually. If I just type in design matrix tutorial and run it, it just flashes up everything at once. So just for save time, so we're gonna say, okay, I've got a word happening at this time. I've got an object being presented a little bit later. I'm going to convolve that time course with an HRF, and then to convolve this time course with an HRF. Let's see what they would look like. Okay, so this is what they would look like. So, so blue is the word, red is the object. So the word would kick off its own HRF here, and the object would kick off its own HRF here. Okay, so that's very much like what we were doing before. Okay, so now is when we can get to kind of prediction, sort of prediction. So we can say, okay, suppose I had a voxel that responded. These things that I just made were just, a bunch of numbers in a row. So that's a vector, and the jargon term for this is a row vector because it's a row. And it turns out, just for no particular reason, just because it's just kind of a tradition of the way you make a design matrix, that we literally just make a design matrix from joining these things together, but we join them together as columns instead of as rows. So we're going to flip this thing that's like a row like this, turn it into a column. So it's going to be a column vector. The way you flip that actually in Matlab is just by putting a little apostrophe sign at the end of it that transposes it, is the term here. So I'm going to make the column vector is the predicted row vector, but just flip. Can you see that little apostrophe there? It's kind of small. Okay. So and so the design matrix is literally just these two column vectors stuck next to each other. So in MATLAB, to stick two vectors next to each other, you just stick them next to each other and put square brackets around them. So, and you know how I said I like kind of meaningfully named variable names? Well, unfortunately, the world of statistics and fMRI doesn't like meaningfully named variable names. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending upon your taste. Design matrices are typically called X. Okay? They're typically actually called capital X. Capital X usually means a matrix, and a small case thing usually means a vector. So if you get into this stuff and you start reading kind of papers about fMRI estimation or general linear models, or also actually almost any paper in machine learning, you'll see things like the data matrix will typically be called something like a big capital X. And then if you really get into SPM, for which we'll be exploring more later, but you don't need to get into this level of detail, and you start trying to go under the hood, you'll find that the variable that encodes the design matrix is called spm.xx.x. So just be forewarned. It's not called design matrix. But here we're going to call it design matrix, okay, which will involve more typing, but hopefully be more understandable. Okay, so what does the design matrix look like? So the design matrix is literally this thing flipped over. So this is the predicted response for what a voxel would look like if it were to respond to the word which gets presented at this time point here. This one here is the predicted response if, I just noticed these aren't lined up perfectly. What the predicted response of a voxel time course would be if it were to respond to the object stimulus, which is this one here. So these are predictors, and they're called regressors in this, which is what you call them in multiple regression. You literally just take these, flip them on their side so they become columns, and then join them together. That's your design matrix. And the way in which design matrix typically get plotted is not as a kind of graph like this, but they typically get shown as a kind of grayscale plot. So these high-level bits would become a bright white, and the low bits would become a dark, and the rest would be a gray. So a typical design matrix kind of looks like this. Okay, so this first column here is this bit flipped on its side, turned into a grayscale thing. And as you see, it kind of goes up. That's the bit that goes up, and it goes down a bit. This is the undershoot, and now it's back at baseline. And then here's the other one, which is the same thing, but just time shifted along a little bit, because this is what you would predict would be triggered by a stimulus, which comes a little bit later. So if you ever see a picture of a design matrix, and when we do analyses in subsequent computer practicals, that's exactly what you'll see. It will look kind of like this, except it will have typically, there'll be a lot more columns in it, because you usually don't just have two conditions in one run. But the subparts of it will look just like this. And when you first see that, that might look kind of like this weird, random, picture of gray stuff. But it's literally just made out of these. It's these things turned into grayscale plots and flipped on their sides. So each column here is a regressor, meaning it's a prediction for what ought to come out of a voxel if it were responding to, in this, for the first column, the first of our conditions, and for the second column, the second of our conditions. Okay, so now we actually are in a position where we can say, okay, these are our predictions. Now we can look at a real time series. It's going to be a pretend time series in this case, but a real time series, and say, okay, I recorded this time series from some voxel, and it's going to be some kind of mixture of this plus this, some amount of this. It might suppose we have a voxel that really loves words but doesn't like objects very much. Then we get many times this thing multiplied by a lot, this thing multiplied by not very much, and those multiplication factors being our measure of how much does the voxel like these particular stimuli. They get called betas in the kind of jargon of regression, and there'll be some noise on top of it too. So let's have a look at what that looks like. Okay. So, and on Thursday or at home, I sent you the links. You can kind of look at read all the comments here if you want to unpack it a bit more. So suppose I have a voxel which perfectly responds to words and doesn't respond to voxels at all. It doesn't respond to objects at all. Okay. Then I'm going to call this thing a sensitivity vector. In regression, it would be called a beta vector, which says, yeah, okay, here's what the kind of response profile of this voxel would look like. So if I take this imagined response profile and I multiply it by the design matrix, this is literally a matrix multiplication. You multiply the matrix by the vector, then I get what the predicted response would be from a voxel that had that kind of profile, and it will look kind of like this. So this is a bit like this is really a statement of the obvious, but it will get a bit less obvious in just a minute. So if my predicted response to words looks like this, and my predicted response to objects looks like this, and I have a voxel that loves words and doesn't care at all about objects, then its predicted response will look like that, right? Obviously enough. And that's literally just taking the design matrix and doing a matrix multiplication of our imagined sensitivity vector, which in this case is 1, 0. Okay? So we're about to run that process backwards, and we're going to say, okay, if suppose I recorded a time course that looked like this, what can I infer about what kind of things this voxel likes to respond to? And you would say, when you run it backwards, and I'll show what running it backwards means in a minute, you would say, oh, well, this looks like a voxel that responds, that loves words and doesn't care at all about objects. And that's exactly what standard fMRI analysis does. Okay, so that's the most simple possible case where you have a pure response to one stimulus class and no response whatsoever to another stimulus class. Life is not usually like that. Okay, so let's make another one. What about one voxel that responds equally to both? Okay, you can kind of see where this is going. So that would look like that. Okay, so here's my predicted response to each individual stimulus, and here's what the predicted response would look like. You'll notice how similar this looks to one of the things we made in the HRF tutorial before. So if I were to record a response from a voxel that kind of looked like this, and if I know that I have one stimulus at this point and a different condition stimulus at this point, then when I run this kind of matrix multiplication backwards, I could say, aha, I think that this is a voxel that likes words to strength 1 and likes objects to strength 1. Even though actually its peak for the object is a little bit lower, but it just looks lower because that peak is kind of sitting on top of the trough here from the previous one. And remember we talked about we're just assuming that they add up, and that turns out to be an actually reasonably close assumption. So, so let's have a look at the more interesting case of I have some. Okay, so to recap. Okay, so what does running backwards mean? So our predicted voxel response is literally, this is, although I'm writing this in English, this is literally exactly the same command in Matlab, without spaces in it. I take my design matrix which says, here's how I think a voxel would respond to condition 1, here's how I think a voxel would respond to condition 2. I've got my sensitivity vector. Now this is going to be the thing that we're going to estimate instead of the thing that we're going to just, say, imagine we had a voxel that, had sensitivity 1 to words and sensitivity 2 to objects. So, so the predicted response equals the design matrix times whatever the degree of sensitivity of the voxel is to these different conditions. Okay, so how do we run this backwards? Well, this thing here, the voxel, can you read, is this text readable from where you're sitting? Okay, good. Okay, so this thing here is what we read with the scanner. This thing here we've built up from knowing what the stimulus onset times are, and this thing here is what we want to figure out. Okay, so if you've studied any linear algebra, or if this is basically just undoing a multiplication. Okay, so if I want to estimate the sensitivity vector, if I multiply this thing by 1 over the design matrix, in matrices it's not actually 1 over the design matrix, it's called a pseudo inverse. Okay, but if I in effect could take 1 over the design matrix and then multiply everything on this side by that, then that would kind of get rid of this design matrix bit, and I'd have pure sensitivity vector, which is kind of what I want. So you end up with the sensitivity vector is 1 over the design matrix, which is the inverse of the design matrix. It's actually the pseudo inverse of the design matrix. If we can talk about that offline, that's more than we need to get into this point. So if I want to recover the pure sensitivity vector, or my estimate of the sensitivity vector, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the voxel response and just multiply it by what in effect is 1 over the design matrix, which in kind of linear algebra terms will be called the pseudo inverse of the design matrix. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So here's a kind of pretend version of that. So we're going to imagine that we measured some voxel data, which if I plot is this. Okay, so suppose I measured some voxel data that kind of look like this. Okay, so you can see this, something happens around this time, and then it kind of looks like something else happens around here, and then there's some noise, and this is kind of a little bit closer to the kind of the actual time series that we actually looked at from the Haxby data. Stuff comes out that kind of looks a little bit like this. Okay, so I say, okay, I measured this from a voxel, and I want to estimate to what degree do I think this voxel is sensitive to the stimulus that I presented, the first one, which I presented I think at time 2, which was the word, the stimulus I presented later on, which was the object. So I do that by taking my measured voxel data, multiplying it by what acts as if it was 1 over the design matrix. It's actually this thing called the pseudo-inverse of the design matrix, but you can think of it as 1 over the design matrix, more or less. And that gives me my estimate of voxel sensitivity. And that's literally the essence of what happens in an fMRI analysis. So you can explore, and I encourage you to do this on Thursday with Dan's help. You can explore the mechanics of this. You can try, putting in different numbers here, see how that alters your estimate. But here's a plot of what that looks like. And I think, plotting stuff is kind of good for really getting an intuitive grasp of what's going on. Although the green is a little bit hard to see here. Okay, so just to recap, so here's our stimuli. So I presented a word at this time. I presented object at this time. Then I recorded this noisy voxel data, which is this green thing here, which is probably a little bit hard to see. And what my regression does is it says, give me the if you give me some units of the thing that this kicks off and some other amount of the some multiplication of the thing that this kicks off, find me the best amounts to multiply those kicked off things by and then add them together to give me the best approximation you can get to this thing I actually measured. Okay, and it turns so this purple line is actually that estimate. Okay, so it estimates. In this case, I think it estimates that you've got a response of about 3 to this and a response of about 1 unit to this. So if you take the HRF that was kicked off by this, multiply it by 3, take the HRF that was kicked off by this, multiply it by 1, and add them up, then you get this purple line here, which, if you can see the green line at all, is a pretty decent-ish approximation to the green line. And that, in fact, is what any regression does. So this is exactly the same as any regression, except many of you will be more familiar with regression where you've got a kind of scatter plot and you've got dots on the x-axis and dots going up the y-axis and you kind of stick a line through them. This is actually exactly the same thing as that, except that here the aim is not so much to kind of stick a line through a cloud of points as to stick a time course as close as stick a predicted time course as close as you can to the measured time course. But in terms of the kind of nuts and bolts of what's happening, it's exactly the same process. And the jargon term for this is the general linear model, which is really just a type of multiple regression. Okay? And multiple in this case just meaning that you've got multiple predictors. So I've got a predictor for what do I think a response would look like to the word stimulus. I've got another predictor called a regressor to what do I think the response would look like, in this case, the object stimulus. So multiple regression means multiple predictors, meaning I've got a couple of things going on. I'm predicting what would happen to each one of them, and I'm going to get an estimate of how much do I think one of them was at play, how much do I think the other one was at play. Okay, so that is the essence of what happens in a standard fMRI analysis. There's a lot of extra machinery to kind of clean things up that we're going to look at, but this is the core of it. Okay, and on Thursday you can play with that a bit more. Okay, we only have a little bit of time. But now we're going to, there's this one other thing which I just want to look at, which turns out to actually use the exact same machinery, as because it's also just doing linear estimates. So remember we looked at this imaginary example of telling the difference between sumo wrestlers and basketball players. Okay, so here's how you do that. It turns out to be almost exactly the same process for this kind of simplest possible type of classifier. Okay, so here's this is basically the same plot as we showed last time, but now I've put actual numbers in it. So this is height and this is weight. This actually says weight, but the letters are getting drawn weirdly here. I don't know why. Okay, so here's height and here's weight. Basketball players are tall and thin. Sumo wrestlers are less tall and heavy. Okay, so and you can kind of see that there's if you were to just eyeball where do I draw a boundary line between these two groups, it would kind of go like this. Okay, now. The reason why it's useful to have a computer algorithm do that for us instead of us kind of eyeballing it is because you can't always eyeball the data. It's always actually good to try and plot it if you can. But what if instead of having 2 dimensions, I had 1,000 dimensions, right? Where each dimension, instead of being height and weight, was the response from a voxel, and I was looking at 1,000 voxels, which is exactly the kind of thing you would do in a pattern-based fMRI analysis. Okay, you can't draw, a 1,000-dimensional plot, and you can't eyeball it, and you can't kind of, figure, I just guess where to draw the line, but you can get an algorithm to do it for you, and it actually is exactly the same process. Okay, so here's what, and I would encourage you also to play around with this on Thursday. So this is the innards of a simple linear classifier. So this column here is height, this column here is weight, and these numbers here are just what I just showed in this plot. So the classification in what you call supervised classification is you say, okay, dear classifier, please give me some kind of line that will put all the sumo wrestlers on one side of the line and all the basketball players on the other side of the line, and that's called a decision boundary. Now, usually, you don't get the luxury of being able to draw a decision boundary that perfectly defines the classes. But in this case, for a toy example, we're going to do that. But you can actually, when you play with this, you can say, well, what happens if I stick this point over here? And you can see how that affects the decision boundary. So you have a desired output. So in this case, we're going to code the classes as +1 for sumo wrestlers and -1 for basketball players. And so that gives us the desired output vector that's just a bunch of 1s and -1s. And we're going to get rid of the means for just like kind of convenience reasons. So just as in the estimating the sensitivity of a voxel, we said here's our measured voxel response. Here's our statement of predictors, and here's what we want to estimate is how much do we think this voxel likes words or how much it likes objects. It turns out that the exact same approach is what's done in a simple linear classifier. You say, here's our data, which in this case is whereabouts on that plot the sumo wrestlers and basketball players are. Here's our what we want to get out as an answer. This corresponds to in the case of the fMRI, the measured data that you're trying to fit. We're trying to find some way of weighting this data such that it gives us as close a match as we can get to these desired classes, where all of the sumo wrestlers get assigned the number 1 and all of the basketball players get assigned the number -1. And you can see I'm skipping over a little bit here, so you can look at the details of it, but you do this exact same trick of using the basically just dividing by the matrix. So if I'm trying to recover the weights, I just as I did in effect 1 over the design matrix, I'm doing 1 over the data matrix in this case, but it's called a pseudo inverse. And the end result is that you get weights that give you an estimate. I'm sorry for going through this a little bit too quick, but this is actually, we're going to mess with classifiers a lot more later on. So you get estimates of the weights, and the end result is you say, if I have weights, if I weight height this much and I weight weight this much, then the end result will assign a value of +1. So here's like the assigned value, +1 to all of the sumo wrestlers and -1 to all the basketball players. So I've kind of taken this, this same plot that you had here before, and I say now, find me some weights using this same kind of like run the multiplication backwards trick with a pseudo inverse. Find me the weights to assign to these different dimensions that will, as well as I can, put all of these guys on one side and all of those guys on the other side, and here's the answer in this case. And so, oops, and this is the kind of, so this is the decision boundary, this kind of cliff here. So so on Thursday, what we're going to do is, so I won't be here, but Thursday will be in the computer lab, like that room 178. So what we'll do is open up Matlab. Remember, it takes like 5 minutes for Matlab to start up on those computers for some reason, and just play with these Matlab things. And what I would especially say is play with putting the stimuli at different times and see how that affects the way the hemodynamic response functions add up on top of each other, and try putting some of the sumo wrestlers or basketball players in different places and see how that affects the decision boundary. And then you'll have a kind of intuitive feel of, what is a design matrix and what is the simplest possible linear classifier. So, and those of you who haven't sent me yet your thoughts about the project, just they can be very initial thoughts. If you can't think of anything else, then this will be a perfectly good thing to do. Go with that very first thing that you suggested of, here's something I kind of care about, I'm going to do my project on that. Because that, pick something that you care about. Thanks very much.
Hey, I had sort of a methodological question.
Yeah.
TRs.
Yeah.
So, what is the logic, or why do sort of, it's conventional to use 2 second TR? Maybe not. But I guess this is sort of my naive understanding is, why do people use 2 compared to 4?
Well, what you want is, you want to get as many, in fact, in ideal world, people could get away with like a 1 second TR.
Yeah,
they
exactly.
would. Yeah. So, no, so what you want is to get as much data as you can.
Sure. Right.
So you want to get as many, volumes as you can. And if you have a scanner that's fast enough to give you a nice, good quality, full brain, I mean, if you care about full brain brain image in like 1 second, which actually a lot of scanners can do these days, then by all means use a TR with 1 second. It turns out that usually you kind of have to cut corners a little bit to get it like super duper duper fast. And so,
Like the field of view wouldn't be as large.
Yeah, or stuff like that. You might not have as many slices, or so if you want, it's not just that you want as fast a TR as you can. You want a kind of as fast a TR as you can, while not eating into the quality too much of each individual stimulus, each individual volume that you require. And most scanners these days can kind of fairly comfortably get a full brain in 2 seconds. But there's nothing magical special about that. And in fact, the scanner's getting faster and faster. Often people have a TR even 1 second. And the other thing is that thanks so much, Ben, for putting it. The other thing is that you're recording something that changes kind of slowly. You're recording this slowly moving HRF.